At first, it looked like nothing more than another heated moment in a competitive game. One of those split-second plays people argue about online, clip up on social media, then move on from by the next morning. A little contact. Some frustration. The kind of thing fans are told to brush off as part of the game. But the more you slow it down, the more you actually watch what happened, the harder it becomes to ignore what this moment really represents. Because this wasn't about a rebound. It wasn't about defense. And it definitely wasn't about basketball instincts taking over. This was about control. This was about frustration. And this was about what happens when a rising star dominates in a space that isn't used to seeing her take over so confidently. What made this moment explode wasn't just the contact itself. It was the timing, the body language, and the reaction afterward. The way it happened after the play was already over. The way the response flipped instantly from aggression to confusion the second attention shifted. And the way the league treated it like something barely worth mentioning. And that's where the Real story begins. Because this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. And it wasn't random. It fits into a pattern that's been quietly forming across women's basketball for years. A pattern where dominating young players don't just get guarded harder. They get tested physically. Where skill gets answered with intimidation. And where veterans who feel their status slipping know exactly how far they can go without facing real consequences. This single moment exposed something much bigger than one player or one game. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because what happened next, and how casually it was brushed aside, tells you everything about the uncomfortable reality the league still refuses to confront. But to understand why this moment matters so much, you first have to understand exactly what happened, second by second, without the excuses, without the jokes, and without pretending it was something it clearly wasn't. When people try to downplay this moment, they usually start with the same argument. They say it happened fast. They say emotions were high. They say contact happens all the time in the paint. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable, until you actually look at the sequence instead of repeating talking points. Because when you slow the play down and watch it carefully, the story completely changes. The possession itself was already over. Aliyah Boston had just made a statement play. The kind of play that shifts momentum and changes the energy in the building. A clean, powerful block. No body contact. No reach across the arms. Just perfect timing and verticality. One dominant big asserting herself against another. The whistle blows. The play stops. The moment is done. And that's when it happens. As Boston turns away from the play, already moving on, the contact doesn't end. It escalates. There's an initial touch to the face that already crosses the line of normal physicality. But what makes this moment impossible to excuse is what comes next. There's a second motion. Not a continuation of momentum. Not an accidental follow-through. A deliberate adjustment of the hand. The fingers turn. The grip changes. And Boston's entire face is grabbed while she's no longer engaged in the play. That detail matters more than anything else. Because incidental contact happens during basketball actions, box outs, rebounds, shot contests. This didn't happen during any of that. This happened after the basketball part was already finished. After the whistle. After the block. After the moment where competition could be used as an excuse. This wasn't a bang-bang play. This wasn't instinct. This wasn't accidental. It was frustration spilling over. And even more telling than the contact itself was the body language immediately afterward. There was no confusion in the moment it happened. No hesitation. No "did I just do that?" reaction. The look was direct. Intentional. Almost daring someone to say something. But the second officials begin to react, the energy shifts. Suddenly the hands are up. Suddenly the face changes. Suddenly it's innocence and disbelief. That switch, that instant transition, is something you only see from players who've been in the league long enough to understand how the game is officiated, how far they can push, and how unlikely it is they'll face serious consequences. And that's why this moment stood out even to people watching live. Broadcast legends noticed it immediately. Not because they were looking for drama, but because it was obvious. When former greats are calling something out in real time, that's usually a sign the line wasn't just crossed, it was stepped over. And yet, despite how clear it looked on replay, the conversation almost instantly shifted away from accountability and toward minimization. People started joking. People started deflecting. People started treating it like a meme instead of a warning sign. And that reaction is exactly why moments like this keep happening. Because when something this blatant gets waved off as competitive, it sends a message. It tells players that frustration is understandable, that retaliation is tolerated, that as long as you don't make it too obvious, the cost is minimal. But here's what makes this situation impossible to separate from the bigger picture. Aliyah Boston wasn't struggling. She wasn't getting shut down. She wasn't having an off night. She was dominating. And in professional sports, dominance changes how people react to you, especially when you're young, confident, and ascending faster than expected. That block wasn't just a block. It was a reminder. It was a challenge. And challenges don't always get answered with better basketball. Sometimes they get answered with something else entirely. And that's where this story stops being about one play and starts becoming about a pattern the league still doesn't want to admit exists. What made this moment explode wasn't just what happened. It was who it happened to, when it happened, and why it happened at that exact point in the game. Because if Aliyah Boston had been struggling, if she'd been having an average night, if she'd been invisible on the floor, none of this would have happened. That's the part people don't like to say out loud. The play didn't come from chaos. It didn't come from desperation defense. It came from dominance, and dominance has a way of exposing nerves that stats never show. Boston wasn't just playing well in this game. She was controlling it, dictating tempo, making her presence unavoidable on both ends of the floor. Every possession she touched felt heavier. Every defensive stand felt louder. And when a player reaches that point, especially against another elite veteran, the dynamic changes fast. This wasn't a random matchup anymore. This was a statement being made in real time. Aliyah Boston had already checked multiple boxes that night. She was finishing efficiently. She was asserting herself inside. She was comfortable, confident, playing loose. And then came the block, not just a rejection, but a clean one. No fouling, no bailout, just elevation and timing. That kind of play does something psychologically. It tells the opponent, I see you. I'm not intimidated. And tonight I'm better. And for some players, especially veterans who've spent years being the one others adjust to, that realization doesn't land quietly. It lands sharply. Because dominance isn't just about numbers on the stat sheet. It's about control. It's about rhythm. It's about the feeling that the game is bending in your direction, and that feeling is impossible to fake. Boston had it. And once a player feels that shift, everything around them changes. Defensive pressure tightens. Physicality increases. Small things start happening after the whistle. Extra contact here. A shove there. Little reminders meant to disrupt flow. That's not accidental. That's not coincidence. That's the sport policing itself in ways the rulebook doesn't cover. And this is where people misunderstand moments like this. They assume frustration comes from losing badly or being outplayed over an entire game. But more often than not, frustration comes from being beaten in moments, single possessions that expose vulnerability. That block did exactly that. It wasn't just two bigs colliding. It was one player rising, and another realizing the hierarchy might be shifting. And when that realization hits mid-game, there's no time to process it calmly. There's no film session buffer. No locker room reset. The emotion has nowhere to go except outward. That's why the response came immediately after the whistle. That's why it wasn't disguised as a basketball move. That's why it was raw. Because dominance doesn't just challenge skill, it challenges identity. And Aliyah Boston represents something very specific in this league right now. She's not a role player. She's not a project. She's not someone trying to find her footing. She's a former #1 pick who arrived with expectations, absorbed the pressure, and is now stepping into the version of herself people predicted years ago. Stronger, more confident, more willing to take space instead of asking for it. That matters, especially in environments where respect is often earned through survival rather than success. What makes this even more important is where this happened. This wasn't a throwaway moment in a meaningless setting. This was unrivaled, a league designed to showcase skill, creativity, and freedom. A space meant to elevate players, not drag old habits along with them. A platform built to let stars shine without the grind of a full WNBA season hanging over them. And yet, the same patterns surfaced anyway. Why? Because dominance doesn't care what league you're in. And insecurity doesn't disappear just because the format changes. Boston's performance made people uncomfortable because it wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't projection. It wasn't potential. It was happening live, on camera, against elite competition. And when that happens, it forces a reaction. Sometimes that reaction is admiration. Sometimes it's adjustment. And sometimes it's resistance. The kind of resistance that shows up not in the box score, but in moments the whistle can't fully control. That's why this incident landed differently with fans who've been paying attention. They've seen this before. Not just once. Not just twice. But repeatedly, every time a young player accelerates faster than expected. And that realization shifts the conversation from what happened to why does this keep happening? Because when the same type of moment shows up again and again around the same type of player, it stops being coincidence. It becomes a pattern. And once you recognize that pattern, the conversation stops being about a single face grab and starts being about a league-wide issue that keeps resurfacing whenever new stars refuse to stay quiet. And that's exactly where this story goes next. Because Aliyah Boston isn't alone in this, not even close. Once you step back from this single moment and stop treating it like an isolated incident, something uncomfortable starts to take shape. Because what happened to Aliyah Boston didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't break the rules of some unwritten code. In many ways, it followed them perfectly. That's the problem. This exact scenario has been playing out across women's basketball for years, especially over the last few seasons, and it almost always follows the same script. A young player arrives with real talent. She impacts the game immediately. She doesn't wait her turn. She doesn't ease into the league. And once she crosses that invisible line from promising to problem, the tone shifts. Defenders stop just guarding her. Contact stops being incidental. And moments start happening that never quite show up in the stat sheet. Fans feel it before they can explain it. Players feel it before they talk about it. And the league avoids naming it altogether. You don't even have to look far for examples. Caitlin Clark felt it almost immediately when she entered the league. Not because she was arrogant, not because she was disrespectful, but because she was effective, instantly. The shots fell. The attention followed. The pressure mounted. And with that came an entirely different level of physicality. Extra bumps on cuts. Late body contact. Hands where they didn't need to be. None of it dramatic enough on its own to spark outrage, but constant enough to send a message. Angel Reese experienced it in a different way. Her physical style became the justification used against her, as if that somehow made her a fair target. Hard fouls were shrugged off. Escalations were reframed as matching her energy. The line between competitiveness and retaliation blurred quickly. Cameron Brink, before her injury, saw it too. Her length and timing disrupted offenses in ways that frustrated opponents. And frustration has a habit of leaking out in moments that look small until you replay them twice. What connects all of these situations isn't personality. It isn't play style. It isn't trash talk. It's timing. These moments don't happen when a player is struggling to find her place. They don't happen when someone is quietly developing on the bench. They happen when a young player accelerates the timeline, when she forces the league to deal with her sooner than expected. That's when the resistance shows up. And it rarely looks like an outright fight or an obvious cheap shot. It's subtler than that. It's pressure disguised as toughness. It's contact disguised as setting a tone. It's retaliation disguised as competitiveness. That's why it keeps happening without real backlash. Because the league can always point to plausible deniability. Officials can call it incidental. Commentators can joke it away. Fans can argue both sides. And in the middle of all that noise, the underlying message gets delivered cleanly. If you dominate too quickly, you're going to get tested. That test isn't about basketball skill. It's about tolerance. How much contact will you absorb? How will you react when it crosses the line? Will you retaliate and risk discipline, or swallow it and keep playing? That's the unspoken exam young stars are forced to pass. And veterans understand this dynamic better than anyone. They know which players get the benefit of the doubt. They know how physical they're allowed to be before whistles change. They know which moments will get replayed, and which will be ignored. That knowledge creates a power imbalance that has nothing to do with talent and everything to do with leverage. When a young player like Aliyah Boston starts controlling games, that imbalance becomes visible. Because she's not just scoring, she's changing expectations. She's forcing people to reconsider who the game revolves around. And that's uncomfortable. Especially in a league where hierarchy has traditionally been enforced through experience rather than production. This is why moments like the face grab resonate so strongly with fans who've been paying attention. Not because they hate physicality, Not because they expect the game to be soft, but because they recognize the pattern. They've seen how quickly physical play ramps up when a young star refuses to stay in her lane. They've seen how often those moments go unpunished. And they've seen how consistently the conversation shifts away from accountability toward, "That's just how it is." But here's the truth no one wants to say plainly. This pattern doesn't protect the game. It doesn't elevate competition. And it doesn't build respect. It stalls growth. Because instead of encouraging skill to rise to the challenge, it teaches players that dominance comes with a physical tax. One the league isn't always willing to step in and stop. And when that becomes normal, the line between toughness and hostility gets dangerously thin. Which brings us to the next uncomfortable reality. This isn't emotional behavior. It isn't spontaneous. And it isn't about losing control. In many cases, it's calculated. And that's exactly what makes it more concerning. One of the biggest mistakes people make when watching moments like this is assuming they come from a loss of control. That frustration boils over. That emotions get the best of someone. That things simply happen fast. But that explanation only works if you ignore how professional sports actually function. Veterans don't survive in elite leagues for a decade or more by being reckless. They last because they understand systems, not just offensive schemes or defensive rotations, but officiating tendencies, league politics, and the invisible boundaries that separate punishable behavior from tolerated behavior. That understanding creates power. And power doesn't usually show itself in obvious ways. It shows itself in timing, in subtlety, in knowing exactly when a moment can be pushed without real consequence. That's what made this incident stand out. Because the contact didn't come during chaos. It didn't come in the middle of a scramble where bodies were flying and whistles were late. It came after order had already been restored, after the play was dead, after the opportunity to hide behind basketball action had passed. That's not accidental. That's deliberate placement. Veteran players know the difference between a moment that will get replayed and one that will be dismissed. They know that officials are far more focused on live action than dead ball interactions. They know that unless something looks egregious in real time, it's unlikely to be escalated. That knowledge creates a narrow window where messages can be sent without penalties following. And this wasn't just about contact, it was about communication. The message wasn't, "I'm trying to stop you." The message was, "I see you, and I'm not comfortable with it." Those are very different things. And the reaction afterward matters just as much as the act itself. Watch how quickly body language changes when authority enters the frame. The aggression disappears. The posture shifts. The expression resets. Confusion replaces intent. It's a practiced response, not because it's rehearsed, but because it's learned. That kind of switch only happens when someone has lived through enough moments to know what works. And that's where the imbalance becomes clear. Young players don't get that benefit. They don't get assumed innocence. They don't get contextual forgiveness. If a rookie reacts the same way, the conversation immediately changes. Suddenly it's about temperament, about maturity, about learning how to behave professionally. The standard shifts depending on where you sit in the hierarchy. That's not theory, that's reality. And it's why moments like this rarely get framed honestly. Because acknowledging intent means acknowledging responsibility. And responsibility requires action. But instead, the conversation often stays shallow. People debate whether the contact was that bad. They argue about how physical the game should be. They reduce the moment to personal opinions. What gets lost is the strategic nature of it all. Veterans don't need to dominate statistically to maintain control. Sometimes control comes from disruption, from unsettling rhythm, from reminding a rising player that success doesn't come without friction. That's why these moments often happen after highlights, after big plays, after momentum swings. It's a way of reasserting presence without changing the box score. And when the league doesn't intervene, that tactic becomes validated. Because the calculation is simple. If the worst outcome is a common foul, if there's no suspension, if there's no public accountability, then the cost-benefit analysis favors the behavior continuing. That's not a character flaw, that's incentive structure. And incentive structures shape behavior far more than emotion ever could. This is where responsibility shifts away from individual players and toward the systems around them. Because leagues set tone not by what they say, but by what they allow. Silence becomes permission. Inaction becomes precedent. And over time, that precedent hardens into culture. A culture where young stars learn quickly that skill alone isn't enough. A culture where veterans understand exactly how far resistance can go. A culture where moments like this feel shocking to outsiders, but familiar to those inside. And that's why focusing solely on the player involved misses the point. Because if this were truly unacceptable behavior, it wouldn't keep happening. If it were truly rare, it wouldn't feel so recognizable. And if it were truly accidental, it wouldn't follow such a consistent pattern. Which brings us to the most revealing part of this entire situation. The league's response. Or more accurately, the absence of one. After moments like this, people naturally wait for the response. Not because they're thirsty for punishment, but because response is how a league defines itself. It's how standards are clarified. It's how lines are drawn. And in this case, the response was simple. Nothing. No escalation. No additional discipline. No clear statement that what happened crossed a boundary. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the play was reviewed, followed by the conclusion that it didn't warrant anything more than what had already been called. On the surface, that sounds procedural, neutral, professional. But in reality, it's one of the loudest messages a league can send. Because when something is reviewed and dismissed, it's no longer ambiguous. It becomes precedent. It tells players exactly where the line is, and more importantly, where it isn't. This wasn't a missed call in real time. This wasn't a ref losing sight of the play. This was a moment slowed down, replayed, evaluated, and ultimately waved through. That matters, because the league didn't just ignore the incident. It validated it by deciding it was acceptable enough to move on from. And that decision doesn't exist in a vacuum. Players notice. Coaches notice. Fans notice. And most importantly, future situations notice. When the league chooses restraint in moments that demand clarity, it doesn't de-escalate behavior. It standardizes it. It tells everyone involved that the cost of pushing boundaries is low, especially if you have the right resume. That's not about favoritism. That's about comfort. Leagues are often slow to confront issues that force uncomfortable conversations, especially when those issues involve respected veterans, iconic figures, or long-standing cultural norms. It's easier to treat moments like this as isolated, easier to frame them as competitive intensity, easier to avoid headlines. But avoidance doesn't make problems disappear. It just delays them until they resurface louder. And fans feel that disconnect immediately. Because when the most memorable moment from a game isn't a highlight, isn't a run, isn't a strategy adjustment, but instead a moment of unnecessary physicality, people expect the league to step in and reset the narrative. Instead, the narrative drifted. Online debates filled the void. Jokes replaced analysis. Serious concerns got buried under memes. And that's not accidental either. Silence creates chaos. Chaos distracts. And distraction protects the status quo. But here's where the league's decision becomes even more consequential. This wasn't a fringe matchup. This wasn't a low-visibility moment. This involved one of the league's most recognizable figures and one of its most important rising stars. That combination should have triggered heightened awareness, not a shrug. Because when you're trying to grow a league, optics matter just as much as outcomes. What you choose to discipline signals what you choose to prioritize. And what you choose to ignore signals what you're willing to live with. In this case, the message was clear. Physical escalation after the whistle isn't a deal breaker. Veteran frustration is understandable. Young stars are expected to absorb it and move on. That's not a written rule, but it's a felt one. And felt rules shape behavior more powerfully than any official policy ever could. The problem is that this approach creates a dangerous imbalance. It places the burden of restraint on the very players the league should be protecting. It tells them that professionalism means tolerance. That composure means silence. That excellence comes with consequences they're expected to endure quietly. And when players do exactly that, when they respond with maturity and restraint, it often gets used as justification for inaction. See, it didn't escalate. Everyone moved on. No harm done. But that logic is backwards. Just because someone handles something professionally doesn't mean it should have happened in the first place. And when the league repeatedly leans on that logic, it trains players to internalize mistreatment as part of the job. That's not toughness. That's normalization. And it raises a critical question the league hasn't answered yet. If this is acceptable now, what becomes acceptable later? Because once a standard is set, it doesn't stay contained. It expands. It gets tested. It gets pushed just a little further each time, which is why comparisons start becoming unavoidable. Because in another league, with similar stakes, similar personalities, and similar egos, moments like this don't end quietly. And that contrast exposes just how much room the WNBA still has to grow when it comes to protecting its product. And that comparison is where this story goes next. The fastest way to understand why this moment bothered so many people isn't to rewatch the play again. It's to imagine it happening somewhere else. Different jerseys, different court, different league. Because when you place this exact sequence into an NBA context, the outcome changes immediately. Not because NBA players are better, tougher, or more disciplined, but because the league has made a clear decision about what it's willing to protect. And that difference matters more than any single foul call ever could. In the NBA, face contact after the whistle is treated as a line you simply don't cross. Not because the league is soft, but because it understands something fundamental about its product. Fans tune in for stars, not power struggles. For skill, not intimidation. For competition, not resentment spilling over. When that line is crossed in the NBA, the response is fast and decisive. Ejections, suspensions, fines that actually sting. Not because the league wants to embarrass players, but because it wants to remove ambiguity. It wants everyone watching to understand where the boundary is and why it exists. That clarity doesn't weaken competition. It strengthens it. Because when players know physical escalation won't be tolerated, the only remaining way to assert dominance is through basketball. Better footwork, better timing, better execution. That's how skill rises. And that's the contrast that keeps coming up when moments like this happen in the WNBA. It's not that the WNBA lacks physicality. It's always been a physical league. It's that physicality hasn't been clearly separated from retaliation, and that gray area creates problems. In the NBA, if a veteran grabs a rising star's face after the whistle, the conversation isn't was it intentional? It's how many games is he getting? Because intent becomes irrelevant once the boundary is crossed. That's what consistency looks like. And consistency is what builds trust, not just with players, but with fans. Fans need to believe that what they're watching is protected. That excellence won't be punished. That dominance won't invite open season. When that belief erodes, so does engagement. Because nobody wants to invest emotionally in a star's growth if they feel like the league won't step in when things go sideways. That's why the NBA is relentless about protecting its biggest draws. Not out of favoritism, but out of self-preservation. It knows its future depends on the visibility, health, and momentum of its stars. And the WNBA is at a similar crossroads right now. Caitlin Clark isn't just a player, she's an entry point for new fans. Aliyah Boston isn't just a center, she's a franchise anchor. Angel Reese isn't just polarizing, she's magnetic. These are the players who bring eyes, debate, and investment. They're the reason casual fans start caring and stay caring. And yet, the league still seems hesitant to protect them with the same urgency. That hesitation doesn't come from bad intentions. It comes from legacy thinking. The idea that toughness equals credibility, that physical tests build respect, that stars should earn it the hard way. But modern sports don't work like that anymore. Earning respect doesn't require punishment. It requires opportunity. And every time a league allows moments like this to pass without consequence, it risks sending the opposite message. That success invites risk instead of reward. That's not just a competitive issue. That's a business issue. Because fans don't show up to watch stars survive adversity. They show up to watch stars shine. They want rivalries built on skill, not grudges. On matchups, not messages sent through contact. The NBA learned that lesson the hard way decades ago. It took controversies, declining ratings, and public backlash to force change. But once it did, the results were undeniable. The WNBA doesn't need to repeat that cycle. It's already in a moment of growth, already gaining attention, already pulling in new audiences. But growth is fragile. And if the league doesn't draw clear lines now, if it keeps relying on ambiguity and tradition instead of clarity and protection, it risks slowing that momentum at the exact moment it should be accelerating. Which brings us back to Aliyah Boston. Because this version of her isn't theoretical anymore. It's real, it's visible, and it's only getting stronger. And that's why what happens next matters even more than what already happened. What makes this entire situation impossible to brush aside is that it isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening at the exact moment Aliyah Boston is becoming something different, something more dangerous to the existing order than people expected her to be this soon. This isn't the same player the league saw last year. During her rookie WNBA season, Boston was good, reliable, efficient. She did what was asked of her. She posted respectable numbers. She played within the system. And for many observers, that was enough to place her in the solid foundation category rather than the future problem category. But Unrivaled has revealed something else entirely. This version of Aliyah Boston plays with ownership. She doesn't look like someone trying to fit in anymore. She looks like someone who knows exactly where she belongs. Her movements are sharper. Her decisions are quicker. There's less hesitation in her game, less checking over her shoulder to see who's supposed to be taking the shot. That shift is subtle, but it's everything. Because confidence doesn't just change how a player performs. It changes how they're perceived by everyone else on the floor. Boston is demanding the ball now. She's taking space instead of conceding it. She's dictating possessions instead of reacting to them. And that's when the dynamic changes. Her offensive evolution is the clearest sign. The willingness to step out, to pull defenders with her, to stretch the floor in ways that didn't exist before. Even when the shots don't all fall, the confidence to take them reshapes how defenses have to respond. That matters. Because once a big becomes a three-level threat, there's nowhere to hide. You can't just pack the paint. You can't just lean on size. You have to make choices, and choices create pressure. On the defensive end, the growth is just as obvious. Timing, anticipation, verticality. Boston isn't just contesting shots, she's erasing them. And when she does it cleanly. No fouling, no theatrics, just control. That's why the block mattered so much. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. And precision is threatening. Because it exposes the gap between preparation and reaction. It shows who's adapting and who's relying on old advantages. What Boston represents right now is inevitability. She's not flashing potential anymore. She's cashing it in. And that kind of ascent forces a reckoning within any competitive hierarchy. Roles shift. Expectations reset. Comfort zones shrink. Veterans who've long occupied certain spaces suddenly feel those spaces tightening. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. But how that discomfort gets expressed is what separates healthy competition from destructive resistance. Boston's transformation is happening publicly, in real time. Every game adds another data point, another clip, another reminder that this isn't a phase. And that's why moments like the face grab can't be separated from her growth. Because when a player is quietly improving, she's easy to ignore. When she starts dominating, she's impossible to dismiss. And when she does it without apology, she becomes a challenge. Not just on the scoreboard, but to the status quo. This is the stage where leagues either protect their emerging stars or expose them to unnecessary obstacles. Where leadership either draws a line or lets culture fill in the gaps. And the uncomfortable truth is that players like Boston are going to keep running into this kind of resistance if nothing changes. Because she's not slowing down. She's not backing off. And she's not going to suddenly become less impactful to make others comfortable. That's not how elite athletes are wired. So the question isn't whether Boston can handle moments like this. She's already shown she can. She stayed composed. She kept playing. She let her game speak. The real question is whether she should have to. Because the more this version of Aliyah Boston shows up, the more often these tensions will surface. And each time they do, the league will be faced with the same choice. Protect the future, or protect tradition. And that choice has consequences far beyond one game, one play, or one headline. The most damaging part of moments like this isn't the contact itself. It's not even the lack of discipline in isolation. It's what those things teach, slowly, quietly, and repeatedly, to everyone watching. Because leagues aren't shaped by their highlight reels. They're shaped by their habits. And when a league develops a habit of letting moments like this slide, it creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond the players directly involved. Start with the fans. Fans tune in for stories, for arcs, for growth. They want to watch players evolve, rivalries form, and excellence rise. They want to feel like the time and emotion they invest in a player will be rewarded with moments of brilliance, not overshadowed by unnecessary drama. But when the most talked about moment from a game isn't a run, a shot, or a sequence of elite basketball, when it's a clip of avoidable physicality, something breaks. The conversation shifts away from the game itself. Skill takes a back seat to controversy, and the league loses control of its narrative. That's dangerous, because casual fans don't stay through that. They don't parse nuance. They don't separate competitive toughness from dirty play. They just see chaos and decide whether it's worth sticking around. And right now, the WNBA is in a moment where every new fan matters. The league has momentum. It has eyes. It has personalities people care about. But momentum isn't permanent. It has to be protected. When leagues fail to protect their stars, they don't just risk injuries. They risk disengagement. They risk turning moments of promise into moments of frustration. They risk teaching fans that investing emotionally comes with an asterisk. And it's not just fans who feel this. Players feel it too. Young players learn quickly what's expected of them, not from rulebooks, but from lived experience. They learn when to speak up and when to stay quiet, when to absorb contact and when to respond, when dominance will be celebrated and when it will be met with resistance. Over time, that shapes careers. Some players internalize it and play through it. Some become more cautious. Some change how they play to avoid attention. And none of that benefits the product. Because the league doesn't grow when its brightest talents feel the need to dim themselves to survive. It grows when they're free to be bold. Moments like this also reinforce outdated narratives the league has been trying to move away from. The idea that women's basketball is defined by chippiness instead of skill. That physical disputes are more memorable than execution. That drama outweighs discipline. Those narratives aren't fair, but they're persistent. And every time a league fails to address unnecessary physical escalation, it feeds them. The irony is that the solution isn't complicated. Fans aren't asking for softness. Players aren't asking for special treatment. They're asking for clarity. They want to know where the line is. They want to know it's enforced consistently. They want to know that dominance won't be punished under the guise of toughness. That's how trust is built. And trust is the foundation of long-term growth. Without it, every breakthrough moment carries an undercurrent of tension. Every rising star feels like a potential flashpoint. Every game risks being remembered for the wrong reasons. That's not sustainable. Especially not for a league that's fighting for space in a crowded sports landscape. The WNBA doesn't need to reinvent itself. It doesn't need to abandon its identity. It just needs to decide what it wants that identity to represent going forward. Because right now, moments like this sit at the intersection of old habits and new possibilities. They're tests, not just of players, but of leadership. And how those tests are handled will determine whether the league's recent growth becomes a foundation or just a phase. Which brings everything back to a single, unavoidable question. What happens next? Because what the league does after moments like this matters far more than what already happened. And that question is where this story ultimately ends. At the end of all this, when the clips stop looping and the debates cool down, the question isn't really about one play. It's not even about one player. It's about what kind of league the WNBA wants to be moving forward. Because moments like this are crossroads. They force choices. And those choices don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they show up in what doesn't happen. Does the league want to be a place where rising stars feel protected enough to fully become themselves? Or a place where dominance comes with an unspoken physical toll that players are expected to accept quietly? Does it want competition defined by execution and adjustment? Or by resistance and intimidation when the balance of power starts to shift? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They're practical ones. Because the league is no longer in a phase where it can afford ambiguity. Too many eyes are watching now. Too many new fans are forming first impressions. Too many players are stepping into the spotlight faster than previous generations ever did. And those players aren't just talented, they're visible. Aliyah Boston is visible. Caitlin Clark is visible. Angel Reese is visible. They don't just represent themselves. They represent the league's future identity. What happens to them, how they're treated, protected, and supported, sends a message that echoes far beyond one season. That's why the face grab mattered. Not because it was shocking, not because it was viral, but because it was revealing. It showed how quickly dominance can trigger resistance, how easily physical escalation can be normalized, and how fast accountability can disappear when tradition feels more comfortable than change. And yet, the most important part of this story isn't what Brittney Griner did. It's what Aliyah Boston didn't do. She didn't retaliate. She didn't escalate. She didn't let the moment define her. She kept playing. She stayed composed. She let her game finish the conversation. That response speaks volumes. It shows maturity. It shows professionalism. It shows star-level poise. But it also raises a hard truth. Just because a player can handle something doesn't mean they should have to. Leagues exist to set standards precisely so players don't have to navigate those moments alone. To ensure that competition stays within boundaries that protect both the product and the people creating it. If those standards remain unclear, or worse, unenforced, then moments like this won't disappear. They'll multiply. Because rising stars aren't going anywhere. They're only getting better, stronger, more confident, more visible. And if the league doesn't decide now how it wants to respond when the hierarchy gets challenged, it risks letting the same cycle repeat itself with a new face every season. That's the real stakes here. Not punishment, not outrage, direction. So the question becomes unavoidable. Should moments like this carry real consequences? Or should they continue to be brushed aside as just part of the game? Because the league's answer won't just shape one headline. It'll shape the next generation. If you care about the future of women's basketball, not just highlights, but growth, then these moments matter. If you want to see stars rise without being tested in ways that have nothing to do with skill, then these conversations matter. And if you're tired of watching dominance get punished while silence gets rewarded, then you're not alone. Drop your take in the comments. Should this have gone further? Or is this just competitive basketball? And if you want honest conversations like this, the kind that don't talk around the issue or sugarcoat what's really happening, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because this league is changing fast, and the way it handles moments like this will decide whether that change leads forward or holds everything back. We'll be watching.